All right, everybody. Welcome to our second session with our wonderful friends from ICSI, Multi-Sectoral Perspectives on Adapting National Infrastructure Systems. How many people are new to this session, weren't here in the previous session? Okay, enough people to do the obligatory safety. So the emergency exit is right behind this young lady with the white shirt, right back that way. Yeah, there we go, there, which is also where the ladies' room is. So if we have an alarm, we all need to exit out there and down 43 flights of stairs. So let's hope we don't have one of those. There is no drill planned for today, so if we hear the alarms, it's a real thing. The gents' room is on the other side of the kitchen on the right-hand side. If anybody needs help or assistance going down the 43 flights of stairs in the event of an evacuation, just see me, and I'll be over by there. All right. I should have started with hello. I'm Chris Bradshaw. I'm the Chief Sustainability and Education Officer for Bentley Systems. And on behalf of Bentley, I'd like to welcome everybody here to our glorious offices on the 43rd floor of 8 Bishopsgate. We have a tiny view of most of South London. No, we have a spectacular view and we love it, so please take advantage. It's been quite a week for me. This is, I don't even know what number session, but it's been really an exciting week. And I think a lot of fantastic sessions. I know this one will be also. I think one of the things that, it was sharing observations about kind of the vibe from somebody who's attended a few different sessions. There's been lots of great conversation. I think one of the overarching things that I'm hearing is a real desire on the part of people who are participating in sessions like this, right? So that's certainly not everybody, but it's people who have a keen interest in sustainability and resilience and so on. And I really have a sense that people are ready for action now. There's been a lot of years of planning, standards, talk, and that's important, and certainly we can't be sort of haphazard, but I really sense a change in the energy that is around in this industry, in this area of ours, in climate and sustainability. And I think it's somewhat being brought on by people are ready to get up and go, and the challenges of climate change are becoming more and more acute every day. Hard to miss what's happening out there, and it's affecting everybody now. And so I think that's another call for urgency on the behalf of folks. So anyway, with that, I am very excited to introduce this next session. And your hostess, is Savina Carlucci, Executive Director at the International Coalition for Sustainable Infrastructure, or ICSI for short. And I welcome her to the stage for her opening remarks. Savina.
Thank you, Chris, and welcome everyone. On behalf of the ICSI, the Coalition for Disaster Resilient Infrastructure, CDRI, and FIDIC, the International Federation of Consulting Engineers, I welcome you to today's session. Thank you for coming. I know it's getting late into Climate Week, and people are starting to feel a bit fatigued of all these events, but I'm glad that you're joining this conversation, which is going to be quite plainly and simply a conversation with experts from a range of different backgrounds on the topic of adaptation of national infrastructure system, adaptation and resilience, that is. I wanted to set the context to this using the UK, since we're in London and it's London Climate Action Week, and using the UK, right? So in April 2025, the Climate Change Committee published this report. There was a quite damning report for the country that kind of found the country is not prepared for climate change. It's not adapting at the pace and scale required. Notwithstanding the escalating climate risk, so just a few stats. UK has experienced its wettest 18 months of record. By 2025, 25% or more of the homes will be subject to flood risk or increased flood risk. Rail and road infrastructure flood exposure could increase from 33 to 50% by 2050. And this comes with a rising cost of inaction. So if we don't deal with climate change, the UK could find that they're losing 7% of GDP by 2050. And the heat-related death, that's a quite striking one. They're already in the thousands, this report found, may surpass 10,000 per year by mid-century. It's a striking stat, I think, this report found. And so the CCC, Climate Change Committee, called for a step change in ambition, real kind of throwing the weight behind the National Adaptation Plan, the third National Adaptation Plan that the UK published, more clear targets for adaptation, more accountability for implementation and adaptation, more coordination in governance, strengthen governments in the dealing with this, because adaptation and resilience is such a cross-cutting issue and requires that kind of joined up governance and less fragmented, more monitoring and evaluation. So a few days ago, I think that was a week ago, the British government published a 10-year infrastructure strategy. So there was some response to this, I think, in the strategy, because there was quite significant emphasis on resilience in the strategy. Less so on adaptation, I would say, but certainly on resilience. Emphasis on reliability of service provided by infrastructure, and also, I guess, and this is more on the adaptation side, a much more longer-term approach to investment, which is obviously, this is kind of the type of long-term view that we need for implementation and adaptation to climate change. So just a few, again, stats from this, and in response to the CCC report that was quite damning. The government is funding at least 725 billion pounds of economic and social infrastructure over the next decade, which is also quite striking, I find. 7.9 billion to strengthen flood resilience. So it's just find it, and I need a table. I don't have enough hands. And this is actually quite, I'm a big fan of maintenance and renewals. I know it's not a very sexy topic, but it's very much needed, especially in a country like the UK, where the vast majority of the infrastructure has already been built, and maintenance, good maintenance is the first line of defense against climate change. So 10 billion pounds annually, according to the strategy, it will be devoted to routine maintenance and renewals, and that, I think, that's a very important one. But, it's also, they've got a 49 billion pounds backlog in maintenance. So they've got quite a few billions to catch up with. There's something on technology. So the development of a national infrastructure spatial tool that links infrastructure planning with climate, housing, and energy futures, and kind of looking at scenarios. So that's also quite important when we think about implementing resilience and adaptation. I mentioned to a nature-based solution and a natural capital approach. Could be, I suppose, embedded in that strategy, but at least, it is mentioned. And something that, I'm an engineer, I lead this coalition of engineering community. For us, standards are absolutely paramount as an enabler of practice and implementation. And then this strategy actually does highlight the need to map and review resilience standards across critical national infrastructure across all sectors to identify gaps and actually then develop new standards when require an update in existing ones. So why am I talking about all of this? Because actually all countries face these challenges. I'm just using the UK as an example. And all the topics that I've touched upon are going to be talked about in our conversation today. So this is not just a matter of whether we need resilience. I think we passed that point. It is now about conversation on how we accelerate implementation. So today's discussion is really just one more, I suppose, convening experts, but I do want to focus as far as possible on how to right? There's so much that is already happening around the world, in pockets perhaps, and definitely not scaled to the level that is required. But can we talk about what can be done and how we can accelerate? So that's kind of what we're trying to do. We're going to be touching upon risk assessment, governance, finance, technology, nature-based solutions that are all building blocks and enablers of implementation of resilience and adaptation. And with that, I'd like to introduce you to my excellent panelists. If I may ask Nikki Van Dijk, Technical Director, Climate Resilience at Morgan McDonald. Please join me, Nikki. Alex Chavarot from CDRI, Coalition for Disaster Resilient Infrastructure. He's one of the report authors of the Global Infrastructure Resilience Report that will be launched at COP, particularly in the topic of finance. Welcome, Alex. Rodrigo Fernandez, Director of ESDG, Empowering Sustainable Development Goals. Actually, no, you're now Global Director of Sustainability, right? You know, I'm getting that right, so welcome, Rodrigo. Caitlin Schilling, please join us, Caitlin. She's the Global Leader for the Resilience and Adaptation Service line at ARP. And then Robert Spencer. Please join us, Robert. Vice Chair of the FIDIC, International Federation of Engineering, Consulting Engineering. You are the Vice Chair of the Sustainable Development Committee, but you're also wearing the other hat of Global ESG Advisory Lead at ACOM. And then finally, Raffaele Della Croce. Thank you for joining us today. Advanced Research Fellow at the Imperial College, but also co-director of the Singapore Green Finance Center. So thank you for joining me. So this is a long panel, but actually what I'm going to do is I will break it because we got an audience and the audience will listen and probably will have some comments along the way. So I'm going to, about halfway through, I'm going to stop and ask for comments and questions. And so it's just to throw a little bit of a spanner in the works to the panelists. But I think it's good to just get the audience also a little bit engaged. And this is a long panel. Right, so I wish I had a third hand. Okay, all right, so I'm ready. So now, as I said, we're going to be touching upon several different topics and themes, and we're going to try to have a bit of a conversation. Please feel free to disagree with each other. If you do want to come in, please, let me know, and then I'm happy to just keep it a bit more of a conversation. But let's maybe start with the kind of governance side of things and policy and the fact that that's such an important aspect to consider. And so I wanted to just get some insights on what you think are the most critical gaps in policy frameworks and regulations that exist now that need to be overcome. And share some examples of where regulatory approaches actually work well and perhaps could be transferred and elsewhere. And maybe if I could start with you, Alex, on this one, please.
Thank you. So I'm here on behalf of the New Delhi-based Coalition for Disaster Resilient Infrastructure, which you may not know, but is perhaps the youngest international organization in the world, in that it became an international organization earlier this year. It was created in 2019, and the purpose of CDRI, as it's otherwise known, is to act as a center of knowledge on adaptation and resilience with a specific focus on infrastructure. And to assist its members, which are countries as well as various international organizations, in capacity building, transfer knowledge, and indeed technical assistance and to some extent access to finance, though CDRI itself doesn't provide any funding. My own background is in the field of infrastructure finance, and so as Savina mentioned, I'm working with CDRI to look at what we want to say on financing resilience in the forthcoming Global Infrastructure Resilience Report, which will be published, as you said, just before COP. So with that background, one of the areas that we're emphasizing in this report is the dichotomy between governance structures relating to the quantification of asset vulnerability to disaster risks and the funding that's required to try and reduce that vulnerability at the national level, which is a discussion that ministries of finance and to some extent ministries of economies have, with what's happening at the sector level. So, sector ministries, take the transport ministry, for example, or the power ministry, as well as the dichotomy between the national level and the subnational levels. And so that, from a government standpoint, is, I think, an area of focus which is relatively new, at least as it relates to financing, because essentially this is about empowering the sector ministries and the subnational agencies to understand their funding requirements and to try and to have a say as to how they can meet such requirements, right? So as an example, India has just completed a study which they've called as part of their national infrastructure plan to do exactly that. And so to work with infrastructure, transport ministries, power ministry, both at the national and subnational level, to map out, firstly, the sort of the critical infrastructure and the systems around that, because it's not just single assets, it's connected assets, as well as funding requirements, and therefore then to have a sort of comprehensive discussion with different stakeholders to discuss how to mobilize finance.
Thank you, Alex. And Raffaele, if I may invite your comments on the same topic.
Sure. First of all, thank you for the invitation. So from my side, from Imperial College side, we have the center here in London, the center in Singapore, and the focus of the research is on finance. And my area of focus is very much resilience and adaptation. But I do think that the real problem when we look at about infrastructure financing, why this is not happening at the scale that we would actually need, is a governance issue that we have. So I think this is the correct way to approach it. And I've been working in policy for quite some time, and at some point I had an experience working with, in Italy, where I'm from, with the Italian Minister for Infrastructure. And he called me back to work on the recovery plan, so it was back 3 years ago. He was very much into the sustainability area, so actually the first thing he did was to change the name of the ministry. Sustainable infrastructure was the new denomination. And then he asked me, so what do we do now? What does it mean, effectively, sustainable infrastructure? And the issues that and that is a big ministry, is responsible for all the roads, rail, airports, ports, but also the real estate in public hands in the country. And is also managing now, a big part of the recovery plan after COVID. So there was an opportunity for the first time actually to invest into a new concept, something that did not happen in the country for 50 years or so. The issues we're facing echo what Alex was saying. I would resume in three main ones. The first one is the planning, the lack of planning. Because when you start thinking about what is sustainable infrastructure, means that you need to know what infrastructure is going to serve the country for, right? And so what is your vision for the country, how you plan to get the infrastructure plan that Savina was mentioning about the UK. Well, that has to be a sectorial plan that then puts together this holistic view about how the country is going to develop in the context of Europe, of course. And that was missing. So on the freight side, on the transport side, they've not been planning over the last 15 years, 20 years. That was the latest plan we had. The second one was the standards, was mentioned, that to me gets into the asset management. So what do we have effectively? as infrastructure? What is the state of our infrastructure? Who owns our infrastructure? And that wasn't not just a trivial question, of course. There was a bridge coming down just a few months before in Italy, you might remember, in Genova. And since then, there's been a big effort at trying to actually see what is the risk that our infrastructure are facing. But the starting point was actually, what do we have? What is the database collecting this data? It doesn't exist. And that is not uncommon in other countries. I'm taking Italy, but... and the third aspect is valuation. So in the investment and infrastructure that we're doing to show the value, one part of it is the reduction of risk, and there is quantification happening through modeling with all the uncertainties and issues that we're facing, lack of data and all that. But there is also the benefits out of the investment, which are not quantified and monetized. And that is due to the uncertainties, complexities, and all that, but also the fact that cost-benefit analysis is not necessarily done at the public sector level. And I think that is a major problem even for private sector. If the public sector doesn't set the scene in that along these dimensions, it's going to be very tricky. And of course, this is a central planning. It adds the complexity, the fact that you need to think about local dimension and across government responsibilities. And that's another.
Thank you, Raffaele. And you touched upon standards, and I also talked about that at the start. And so to that aspiration from the infrastructure strategy in the UK that they're going to review and update the standards and technical codes, Nikki, if I can come to you, and how can governments, what's the role of governments in here? I mean, obviously now the UK is showing that the government wants to weigh into this, and I wish more governments did this. And also, probably the question is, how do we get more governments to actually recognize that this is a very important, enabler or practice, and how to enforce them? It's one thing you only just have codes and standards, and then it's also the enforcing them so that they are applied.
Yeah, thanks, Savina, and thanks very much for the invitation to be here today. So I'm from Mott MacDonald. We work on many nationally significant infrastructure projects in the UK and internationally. And I'm a specialist in climate resilience. So I work with our engineers and our design teams to bring that climate resilience angle to what they're doing. So technical standards are hugely important and probably something I spend most of my week talking to engineers and designers about. So your question is about what does government or what can government do about it? And I think from my experience, or the projects that I work on mainly, government do have a role to play, certainly through regulators in terms of what's required and enforcing those. But it's the standard setting organisations and the asset management and asset owning organisations themselves that create their own standards, where I'm probably closest to and see the most action actually happening in terms of reviewing and updating technical standards. And the nationally significant infrastructure projects are one of the best kind of opportunities that we have for doing that, because of their size, their importance. We can do things maybe slightly differently on those projects that we don't always have the same opportunities to do on smaller projects. And we've working with our engineers at the moment, looking at, well, what are the codes and standards that you're using? What weather or climate related parameters and values are you using? Are they based on historic weather data? Can we redo those design calculations using projected data? What's the difference? Is it material? Is it significant? What should we do about it? So asking those kind of questions with our design teams and challenging standards is one of our kind of the main things we can do. But I guess the opportunity or the freedom to be able to do that, to challenge standards, is something we don't always have that opportunity. So I think that's maybe a role for government and regulators to actually give engineers and designers the space to challenge that sometimes. But I say most of what we do is with the asset-owning organisations themselves, and they set their own technical standards. They write the requirements for projects. They may be commissioning contractors. We're writing main works contractor specifications at the moment, for example. That's another opportunity, right, to get climate resilience requirements into design and construction of major projects. So there's lots of points of entry. We just need to be really good at finding them and making sure that we get the climate resilience questions in.
Thank you. And of course, procurement is another one, right, where you can make sure that those requirements are put in and ensure that they are embedded in the development downstream. So we've got some examples actually from elsewhere in the world, and I know that the FIDIC, the international, I'll call it FIDIC, it is the International Federation of Consulting Engineers. They are going to soon launch a State of the World report. So coming to you, Robert, in your kind of capacity of FIDIC rep in this panel. So where do we see strong private sector capacity for resilience and adaptation implementation, particularly in the emerging economies? And where are the critical gaps? So what is this reporting found?
Thanks for the question, and good afternoon, everyone. So, yes, I'm going to sort of answer questions this afternoon with the sort of two hats on, so hopefully later on I'll be able to have the opportunity to give some examples from our work at AECOM as well. But yeah, no, to your point, and Basma, the principal author of the report, is actually in the room with us, so do come and ask her questions afterwards as well during the networking reception. So FIDIC periodically produces State of the World reports on key topics of interest to the engineering community worldwide. FIDIC has over 1 million engineers on its membership list, individuals, as well as lots of member associations in different countries. So it's a really good foundation for the wider global engineering community to look to for guidance and so on. So that's why these reports are published from time to time, not only for the internal community, but also for the associated communities, in particular the multilateral development banks, which tend to heavily rely on FIDIC contract templates for their work. So it's an exciting time, and FIDIC's involved in a lot of work with respect to adaptation, resilience, and decarbonisation of infrastructure, and we'll be highlighting more of that at our Global Infrastructure Forum, which takes place in Cape Town later this year in September. So the report that you refer to is called the Infrastructure Adaptation for Emerging Economies report, Scaling Sustainable Solutions. And I guess what I'd like to highlight first, I suppose, is the gaps. So we'll come at it from the gaps first, and then we'll come to the strengths. And I think I'll just skip through the gaps. No one wants to dwell on the bad news for too long, but we do need to know where we need to focus effort. And I think actually people like Alex and others in the panel have already touched on them. So fragmented governance came through quite strongly, and also, quite frankly, in the discussions we were having this morning in this venue as well, that was clear that when we heard from PIDG, for example, and the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, quite often the bulk of the initial funding actually needs to be spent on building the capacity and governance expertise of the host community, host project, host nation, host agency to be able to make good decisions, to have the technology that they need to support them, to have the governance structures that they need to support them. So I think I totally agree with that point that was made earlier. And I think also the interagency coordination is really, really important as well. And indeed, advanced economies are not immune from that. If you take the UK, I think there could be really good collaboration between the Department for Transport and DESNES on hydrogen, for example, because at the moment there's widely diverging definitions on the types of hydrogen and the types of application that will be funded. So, we're not just talking about emerging economy problems here. These need to be addressed worldwide. But in terms of the engineering and infrastructure expertise gaps, I think that's where we do have some challenges, particularly in the emerging economies, that we need to find ways of addressing. Climate resilient design. I was just talking to Nikki earlier, and even in our own global businesses, we're finding that only in the last 2 to 3 years have we really been able to integrate the climate resilient adaptation design practices right inside the engineering teams. Previously, sustainability, resilience, adaptation folks, they've been sort of niche experts on the side or in the environment business. And only now with, companies like ours, AECOM, Jacobs, Moss, all of our peer group, we're sort of really realizing that we have to bring these skills in-house. That has to be integrated fully with the engineering expertise. So that's a really important point. linked with that, and of course we're in the home of Bentley, is the digital interface. And digital tools need to be increasingly integrated into the normal management systems that we have for infrastructure development. And again, that's really tricky in some emerging economies where there just aren't the resources to invest in those advanced technical systems. So therefore, when we're having an intervention that's coming in perhaps funded by a private infrastructure development fund or a multilateral development bank, then again, part of that early work needs to be the capacity building. I remember when Philippe was talking this morning, he said of a sort of 20 million project, a couple of million had to be spent immediately on just mobilizing, transitioning the skills base up, helping with decision making, that kind of thing. So that early cushioning is really, really critical. So I'll leave it there because I've already sort of offered some solutions within the problematization process. I hope that helps get things started.
Thank you. And Rodrigo, I'll come to you for a question. And so you represent Bentley Systems. It is a private sector organization. You obviously have a very strong technology lens. But Bentley is also quite pioneering in a way that it's really kind of reaching out, I think, to try and engage with influence policy and engage with financiers. I mean, in the morning you hosted a session of Fast Infra, right? And I know you are doing several activities that are really trying to kind of foster that collaboration, right? Private sector, but also who else needs to come to the table. Yeah, can you maybe just tell us a bit more?
Sure. Okay, so thank you, Sabina. So I'm from Bentley Systems. Just for those that don't know, we don't sell cars, okay? So we sell software for designing, building, and operating infrastructure. So I think, positives and gaps, I would say, coming into this, stepping back. So we see, emerging economies that are facing, I would say, smart city initiatives and population growth, extreme weather events, happening there. When they combine these aspects, it's where we see more expansion of digital technologies. We have good examples in India, for instance, and some African cities as well, where we have projects like in water resilience and energy as well. And those are good examples where we see expansion of technologies and digital tools there. But in terms of gaps, I think Robert mentioned most of them, right? So and also I think project pipelines are really key to be there. But then you need I think the teams there will need to be able to do climate risk analysis, to do the upstream work to prepare the project, right? And they need to be able to do it in advance. There's where digital tools can also help. So the governance side has this limitation in emerging countries. Then technical capacity that you mentioned, right? So it's always a limitation there. But in some cases, emerging countries don't have access to tools, to data, to the technologies that exist. So capacity building is really, really key. And then also policy and regulatory incentives. Like I think that the private sector responds to these signals, to clear signals like mandatory climate disclosures, resilience standards, or procurement that you were mentioning. Like the procurement that tries to criteria to reward long-term performance. I think it's a key aspect that it's not included. And we come up with this idea that we need to find a way to connect all these dots, right? We need to connect the governance, the capacity building, the regulatory framework. So that's why we are partnering with many organizations, NGOs like yours. It's why other teams at Bentley, led by Mark Coates, for instance, doing infrastructure policy advancement, trying to connect the dots with the finance sector and insurance companies as well. And it's also, I'm part of sustainability and education team because we want to connect sustainability and education because capacity building is essential for building this capacity.
Thank you. And so technology data as kind of a basis for enhanced decision making for resilience, right? I'm going to just come to you, Caitlin, and this is not an easy question. I know it's kind of swapped, but I'm kind of following the thread of the conversation, so bear with me. So we know there are financing complaints. So if we could do everything everywhere all at once, we would, right? But we can't. And so there are competing demands, there are trade-offs. So just some thoughts on prioritization of interventions. And so what kind of sectors, if we can just, maybe, and I know this is not an answer that is same for all countries, right, all contexts, and it's context dependent. But what sectors, what interventions, in your view, should be prioritized for enhancing resilience and building adaptation?
Great, thanks, Savina. Hi, and thank you for inviting me to this. So I'm Caitlin. I'm from Arup. We're an engineering and design firm similar to AECOM and MOTS. We've been doing quite a lot of work in the resilience and adaptation space for a long time. And my background, I'm not an engineer. I'm an economist by training, and I've worked in international development for most of my career. So some of this conversation about the sort of capacity building in emerging markets and what you need to do in those places is true. And there's also a lot of capacity in those places. Savina and I met 6 years ago, working on a project on asset management in Bangladesh, where they have an amazing agency that has that vision set for what they're trying to do for their country. And so they have that approach of they're building their roads for access to markets. And so they have prioritized that based on what the people need. So talking a lot about infrastructure, might talk a little bit about people, because that's why we have infrastructure. And so thinking about that, and so in terms of that prioritization question, I think, we've talked a bit about climate risk assessments, and I think that that is an important step in the process. You need to go through and understand where are the risks and vulnerabilities, and where are they most extreme for which parts of which critical infrastructure in which places that are really, really important to people. And that's going to be different in different places. And then you can work through and identify that prioritization. And in some places, a lot of places, it might be energy. There's a ton of stuff. Sorry, I'm an American and I really end up cussing a lot, so I'll try not to. But there's just a huge amount of infrastructure that relies on the energy system, hospitals, the trains, even like roads and having the street lamps work, all of that. So I think that's a really critical piece. Water and the water infrastructure, depending on sort of where you are, making sure that you have access to clean water, water for irrigation, some of those kinds of elements. And then you get into, we do a lot of work, I'm based in Sydney, Australia, and so we do a lot of work in the Pacific. And so connectivity ends up being really, really, really critical. So we're doing some climate risk assessment work with the Asian Development Bank in the Cook Islands on airports and ports. And they are investing a lot in understanding where the vulnerabilities come from in their airports. We're doing a similar piece of work in Australia. And the budget in Australia is about a third the size of what we're doing in the Cook Islands. And part of the reason for that is we're doing regional airports in Australia. You have roads, rail, ports, and a whole bunch of other ways that you can move stuff around within Australia. In the Cook Islands, if the port goes down and if the airport goes down, everything goes down. You don't have water, you don't have medicine, you don't have food. And so those kinds of things need to be really important. So they're investing in it. So in the Cook Islands, 100% transport connectivity. Like that is where the priority is, and that's where the priority should be. But in other places, it's going to be energy, because they need to make sure that that's working. The airport also needs energy, but then they import the gas to do the generators, and that's how they deal with that. But yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, I just wanted to build a bit on that, because I think I agree that the question was which infrastructure sectors should be prioritised, and I don't think that's really a question you can very easily answer. It's different in different places. But the key to what I think Caitlin was just saying is it's not about infrastructure sectors, it's about systems, right? And how different bits of infrastructure sectors work together as systems. don't think probably any single sector that is not interdependent or reliant on another infrastructure sector. So working out where the priority for investing in resilience or adaptation, for me, is a systems question. So what is it? What does your asset do? It's a water treatment works, let's say. What is it dependent on to provide clean water? It's dependent on energy. Where does the energy come from? It comes from a substation down the road. What's the substation vulnerable to? It's in the floodplain. It's vulnerable to flooding. So, okay, we've identified that the substation is the point of weakness, the point of vulnerability. The water company that owns the treatment works and delivers clean water to people doesn't own the substation. It doesn't have any direct influence on what happens at the substation. But in the system, if you look at the systems map, that's the point, that's the node where actually it makes most sense to invest in upgrading or making it more resilient. What the water company might decide to do is, because they have little influence, is put backup power generators at their site. That's also a valid option. But it may not be the most efficient, effective, or cost-effective measure if you actually took a systems view. So understanding this connectivity between infrastructure sectors and infrastructure assets, I think, is the key to identifying where you prioritize your investment and your action.
Sorry, Savina, I was just going to say, and what the people actually care about, because there's going to be different priorities in different places based on what's most important to the people that rely on those systems.
And people might think, so the system question is a difficult question. I mean, it's absolutely where, our thinking should be. Do we need sophisticated models to understand system dependencies to the level of prioritization of pipelines? Sorry, this is not a question.
Can I come back on that?
It's just my own question.
Yeah, so we've been doing quite a lot of work in the UK in the last year or so because of, I don't know if people are familiar with the UK Climate Change Act. There's an adaptation reporting power. Asset owners have to report to government every 5 years on their risks and adaptation. And after the last round, the Climate Change Committee sort of said, look, interdependencies, this what we're talking about is lacking. We don't really understand it. So we've been doing quite a lot of work in the last couple of years using systems mapping with infrastructure asset owners, and it's not a hugely complicated tool. It's mostly about getting the right people in a room to identify, well, you understand your bit of the system, you understand your bit of the system. Let's join that up and put it on a map and work out, can we trace these cascading failures, these impact pathways through the system. So it's not necessarily a very sort of complex solution. It's more about getting the right people in the room and mapping that system.
And I think, I tend to agree with that, Nikki, but I think there needs to be two components to make it intelligible, so to speak. One is a framework that helps identify A, critical infrastructure, and B, materiality of exposure to disaster risks, let's call it that way, right? So how do you define that? Brazil is doing this at the moment, and I think they will showcase that in the next few months. The second thing that I think is important is understanding the data. As some of you know, I also wear a sort of insurance hat from time to time. And what strikes me looking at the insurance industry from the outside in some ways is that it doesn't provide adjustments to vulnerability curves based on resilience interventions that are frankly reliable, right? And so if you don't make that link between de-risking, namely reducing vulnerability, and the benefits that this generates, we collectively have an issue. And so I think we need to try and address that together.
This question got you all going, huh? Okay, so I guess Robert and then Caitlin and then Rodrigo, if you wanted to add anything. Robert?
Yeah, I think that one of the things that we need to be mindful of that sort of we're encountering, and just by way of example, to follow up on your regional example, Caitlin, in Australia and New Zealand, about 80% of our advisory work is adaptation and resilience work for municipal and state agencies and the like. And what we're finding is there's an interesting dynamic in the market at the moment where you have quite a few tech startups that have produced very rapid scoring models for clients to sort of log in, put in a few assets, and they'll get a score. And they'll think, okay, I've started my risk assessment. Trouble is, the number's practically meaningless. So there's a numerative value that comes out that, okay, you've got a 4. Okay, I've got a 4 for my what do I do? So I think that there needs to be that recognition that although we're getting very good at understanding what the risk level could be from a very quick automated analysis, the challenge then is to bring the expertise around that and look at what the interventions could be that then diminish the risk, hopefully bring down the insurance premiums, hopefully enhance the ability for improvements or maintenance. And I agree with your point on maintenance, how important it is, gets streamlined and funded and prioritized. So I just wanted to bring in that reflection as well, that the climate risk assessment process still needs a human engineer or two behind it, and we can't rely totally on technology for that.
I could not agree more. That was like, we're facing similar challenges where we see they're not even risk assessments, they're exposure assessments at best, partly because they don't incorporate that point you're making about the vulnerability and sort of what are the vulnerability interventions that you can make that actually really make a difference. And we know what some of them are, but we haven't been able to explain it, quantify it in a sufficient way that the insurance companies then understand, or that the banks that are financing understand, so that you get that benefit, the commercial benefit back to the person who is investing or the company that's investing in that process. And I think it's one of the things that has come up at a number of the events this week is sort of that resilience or adaptation investment. Often the return on that investment does not accrue entirely to the person, to the investor. It accrues more broadly. And so then that becomes quite hard to justify unless you're getting an insurance premium break, unless you're getting a better deal with the bank, unless you're getting some kind of commercial return, or you can really understand what the data is telling you about the costs that you are not incurring because your thing went down for 3 weeks and you lost revenue.
This is true of governments as well, right?
Yeah.
When we talk to various governments at CDRI and about defining and implementing some form of framework that can help them allocate budgets between disaster risk reduction, so pre-disaster, versus mobilizing contingent capital to be applied post-disaster, and therefore paying a premium along the way, their answer quite naturally is, well, show me the benefits. Show me the benefits in indeed reduced insurance, potentially show me the benefits in improvements in sovereign ratings, but it's a difficult exercise to look at the counterfactual, and explain to me why I should do that as opposed to allocating my budgets to education, social housing, or indeed helping the growth of my economy.
We're just bad at it. I mean, we don't do this very well in health either, right? We don't invest in prevention, in health prevention, certainly not in America, it's a problem. But we just wait until someone ends up in the hospital.
Rodrigo?
Yeah, so almost everything was said, but I want to reiterate some aspects, right? So, risk is a combination of hazard and exposure and vulnerability, indeed. And from the hazard side, we can and we need to do the predictions and the simulations and all that, and we need to do the climate mitigation to avoid it and to control it somehow. But when we look to assets, to asset owners and to operators, and the point that they really control is vulnerability and vulnerability reduction. exposure. Okay, they can relocate an asset, but sometimes they cannot. So it's very difficult, right? Vulnerability reduction is where they can and where they act, and this is really important to focus on this. The other aspect is the fact that when we look, depending on the economies, if we are talking about emerging economies or the developed world, but if we look to the developed world, the infrastructure we will have in 2050, 80% of the infrastructure we will have in 2050 is already here right now. It will be old. It's getting older. When the water infrastructure systems in London is 100 years old? I'm not sure. But so this is crazy. The reducing vulnerabilities of all these systems, it's key. And I would say that if in one side we don't need great technologies to map the supply chains, the dependencies that are around infrastructure. The fact is, if you want to quantify it and finding out the impacts of reducing vulnerabilities and how this all connects, you need complex systems to make scenario analysis, to put them and then to link all this and say, okay, what happens if I put this system here? If I reduce this vulnerability, what's going to be the impact? You need develop digital tools, digital twins to bring this with more accuracy and confidence. That's what I feel, right? So I was in Lisbon before the power cut in the power outage. I was taking a plane to London 5 minutes before the power outage. And I was in London affected by the power outage because basically I didn't have communications because roaming was not working, because I could not connect to the mother company, because they didn't have power, they cut down any kinds of services. So I was in London without possibility to have communications. And once I was seeing news in BBC live from Lisbon and Valencia, giving all the news, and I was unable to call Portugal. And I was seeing they didn't have water because water pumps were not, the pumps didn't have energy. They didn't have transportation because everything was stopped, rail, semaphores, signaling. Nothing was working right now at that moment. And you can see the interdependency. But then they failed to quantify what was the impact that a power outage would have in the systems, because they didn't make the scenario plan, the simulations. So they underestimated the impacts because they could map it, but they simply didn't quantify the relevance of it.
Also, I think I definitely agree on the lack of connection between the quantification of risk and then the measures to respond to those risks, and that is also from a research perspective, from the complexities in the modeling side, of especially adding, compounding the effects, the multi-hazard, nature of the extreme events we're seeing, chronic events, and so forth. The importance of nature, which is coming more and more. You mentioned water. We've been looking at the green data centers and how the impact of water is not just energy consumption, but also water is key, as for many other infrastructure. And I think in the resilience, when we have this discussion about systemic thinking, we can go in so many different directions. We have to be clear to what we are resilient. So, for example, I make the example of the energy sector where we're working at the moment. There is new work that is developing the International Energy Agency. And this is the new narrative about energy security. And you think about how resilient your supply energy structure, what is your demand resilience, what is your, not just that, but your supply chains, your critical minerals. It's those dimensions that make resilient the system from an energy perspective, which of course is a very different technical specification at the asset level. And in that sense, one important point that we shouldn't miss is that when talking about resilience, especially in the climate space, we cannot miss the transition aspect of it. It cannot be a separate agenda. We're not going anywhere otherwise. It has to be something connected. If possible, exploit the synergies when possible. And thinking energy transition, we need grids. Well, grids need to be taken into account the 30, 50 years projections in climate change. what are the standards and how do we connect to the investment planning which is needed there.
Thank you. So I'm going to just stop us here for a second, and and maybe just turn to the audience in case someone wanted to make a comment or ask a question or add anything to the discussion that we've had so far. Yes, Marco.
Thank you very much. All of this was very, very interesting, and all the position that you point. Maybe the only question I had, when you try to define what is the infrastructure which is the most priority, looking at the dependencies, etc. Like this panel is about adapting national infrastructure, but how does the subnational differences need to be taken into account when one does this kind of prioritization and the planning? Thanks.
Anyone? Oh, is this a question or a follow-up, or is it?
It's a separate question.
Is that a separate question? Okay, let's just take this first.
I mean, it depends on the country and the governance systems to some degree, right? So like in Australia, a lot of the infrastructure is under state control. So then the state is taking the action. And then it goes national, state, and then straight down to councils, which in most places, some places have cities, other places, anyway, it's confusing. But the councils control nothing, or very little. They often control waste. But they're at the front line. And so I think that's where that understanding between the different scales, I think, is a really important question, because what's going to be most important to the community, the council will know about, and they're going to complain a lot to their politicians. But then how does that get translated back up to the state level, where they actually have like the transport agency, Transport for New South Wales, Main Roads WA, some others, so there's that communication, I think, is really key, because the other thing is nobody owns all of it, right? Like I think what Nikki was saying before about you've got to get the right people in the room, and sometimes that's going to be subnational, national, city level, council level, so that they can sort of have that communication and figure out who is responsible for which bit, and where are their gaps once they've figured some of that out. And
Yeah, I would just add that, I think the local perspective is really key here, right? So when we talk about resilience, we need to talk about local perspectives. And I think it's also from our perspective as well, we see, lots of projects on a scale that is on a city scale, or on where we see things really happening, and vulnerability reductions and repairs and maintenance and all that. And I think it's the way to go. People are moving to cities. Much more pressure on these systems are coming in. So I think it's a more controlled environment, but it's also where they can and where they are doing more. When I look to the world, but, apart from the governance perspective, from a technological perspective, we see more possibilities there happening today than in the other areas that are more, in some cases more difficult to control.
Thank you. Maybe the other question, please.
Okay, thank you. I am Carl Peet. I lead global strategy for the Conservation Biology Institute. We're an NGO that translates conservation science to action. And we have launched an initiative known as the Global Wildfire Collective to bring together wildfire researchers, firefighting agencies, local and indigenous communities, et cetera, industry, to address this issue that's not only intensifying in certain places, like many climate issues, but also emerging for some markets where, I shouldn't say markets, I should say communities, countries, ecosystems where we've never seen it before. So my question really is, how are national infrastructure plans dealing with this, with wildfire as a cross-cutting issue, because it affects energy. It's caused by energy infrastructure and also affects energy infrastructure. It affects transport, linear infrastructure, buildings, human health. So what are you seeing in your own work and in emerging national plans, and how can the Global Wildfire Collective support? Thanks.
Okay, me again. Great question. We, again, live in Australia. I was living in California before, so wildfire, bushfire, something that has been front of mind for a long time. It's definitely one of the hazards that we take into account in our climate risk assessments, but it's quite challenging, as you would know, because the bushfire risk depends a lot on what the fire load is and wind patterns and a whole bunch of other things and how that affects, which is really hard to build into a climate scenario because you don't know what the vegetation load is going to be in 2040 in that place. So there's I think some elements around how do you do fire management and manage control, and that's one of the recommendations that we often make coming out of a risk assessment is making sure that the bushfire response or bushfire preparation is built into the system. But I think that's something that, again, going back to the earlier question about different scales of government, who's responsible for which bit, like that also matters a lot because some of the fire risk is going to be in parks and far away, and then it's going to spread. And so how much are you just trying to protect your asset? How much are you trying to reduce the scale? And I mean, I was trying to explain to friends back in the US, like the scale of bushfires in Australia, and it like I couldn't wrap my head. I was like, it's the size of Rhode Island. Like it's a state. Like the state burned down. Like, and I think and it impacts across everything. And then if you talk to air quality experts, it's really fun because all that bushfire, like smoke inhalation, that lasts your whole life, and it just accumulates. So that's great. But again, how we build that into the climate risk assessment component as well as we can. Love to get better at it, and happy to have a follow-up conversation.
Yeah, thanks. And I've done about 20 years now of kind of climate risk assessment. So it's, and absolutely, as Caitlin said, and actually most of my experience is UK. 20 years ago, it was not on the list of hazards we'd even think about for most UK infrastructure climate risk assessments. It is now, and lots of our clients are asking us to consider wildfire alongside, high temperatures, drought, rainfall, all the other things that we would normally have considered. But it's taken a bit of catching up. I think the UK, we have a bit of a national psyche that is a kind of cold, damp island, and that's changing really rapidly. And some of our biggest hazards come from heat, drought, and wildfire. I think is absolutely on that list, whereas maybe it hadn't been before. I think it also, we were saying before about the looking at hazards and risks at different scales, and it being very much a kind of adaptation is a place-based issue, and this hazard, wildfire hazard, is absolutely a place-based thing. It's not the same everywhere. The risk is quite different in different parts, at least of the UK, and that's why we don't have a kind of a single hazard list or a single approach to risk assessment. It's trying to work out for the asset, for the organisation, whoever it is we're doing it for, what are the material hazards, and wildfire is definitely on the list, whereas it probably wasn't when I started doing this. I don't think we probably need some more help to assess it and plan for it and actually put measures in place to deal with it, but it's rising the agenda, definitely.
Yes, please.
Thank you. I'm Nick Hardman-Mountford from Conservation International. I'm wondering, I haven't heard much talk about nature-based infrastructure or green-grey infrastructure from the panel. So to what extent is it featuring in adaptation planning? And given there hasn't been much mention of it, what are the barriers to adopting nature as infrastructure?
That's one more question in the next page, so thank you, Nick. Thank you for bringing us back to the... Yes, Robert, and then I think Caitlin as well. You had...
I think it's starting to come up the agenda pretty fast. One of the things I'd like to mention is the Nature Positive Infrastructure Playbook that we developed with your colleagues over at WWF. and FIDIC last year. That's in its second edition now. And the interesting thing there is that FIDIC are now developing it into a training manual for engineers who aren't nature specialists to understand how to consider nature as a solution, and for all the usual risks that you might be thinking of, coastal resilience and so on. I was just struck when I was sort of doing a bit of research in-house at AECOM for this panel, how much of our work's actually on coastal resilience and how much that's involving nature or hybrid solutions. So I'll give you one example. Actually comes from the States, called Refence, which is with a collaboration with U.S. Department of Defense, DARPA, in fact, and University of Miami, where we're looking at climate hazards, including sea level rise, coastal erosion, storm surges. We're actually developing quite innovative hybrid reef structures to attenuate the wave energy. Now, why do I mention this? Because I think it's probably globally applicable. The technology's not that difficult to replicate, but it does have substantial co-benefits for marine life, because effectively what you're doing is you're creating or enhancing new self-healing coral reefs. And so what we do is we 3D print a concrete gyroid structure, and then what's the word? Incubate. I can't remember the word for it. But anyway, get the coral to grow on that, working on an alkaline substrate. Because of course, one of the problems with climate change is that you're getting more CO2 absorbed in the sea, so the sea's becoming more acidic, which makes it difficult for the corals to grow. So you've got to attenuate that. And then you've got the heat as well. So you need more thermal tolerant coral species. So you propagate. That's the word I was trying to think of. Propagate them into the system as well. And I think that's really a worldwide solution. And we're working quite a bit with Great Barrier Reef, with Belize reefs, and we're building the largest artificial reef in Dubai as well to recover fisheries and reduce storm risk there. So I know it's probably not front of center, but if you dig a little deeper, you will find really good examples. And I know Caitlin's itching to give you some Arab ones as well that say that sort of counter your argument, I guess.
Well, I'll be generous and also give Deltares, I think it's Deltares, is partnering with Delft in the Maldives and doing something quite similar and doing quite a lot of research around sort of what's going to be effective in that space. I think you've touched on some good solutions. There's a number of sort of solutions, and I think there is that partnership, I think, between gray and green or blue is an important piece to pull together, because nature's not going to be able to do it on its own anymore. It needs a bit of help. There's projects that we've worked on where it's putting walls in under dunes, and then you don't notice that there's anything gray there. And I mean, dunes are brown, but there's sand around it, so it looks all quite natural. But there's some reinforcement underneath. But to your question about the barriers, one of the things that we see is the nature-based solutions are slower to be effective, although they might be cheaper to do. And so then you have a lot of concern from the developers, from government, when is it going to work? How well is it going to work? What are the guidelines? What are the sort of regulations around it? And what do you do until it becomes effective? And then what's the plan for asset management? Keeps coming up. Also a big fan of asset management. You also need green asset management. And there's actually a tech company in Singapore that has done this is so amazing. They've mapped all the trees in Singapore, and they do tree maintenance so that there's no more tree-related incidents, or where they were having 1,000 a year of tree-related incidents where branches were falling down in storms. And because they do preventative green asset management, they cut that down to 30 a year or something. It's quite remarkable what you can do, but nature-based solutions are not quick and dirty solutions. They are sometimes dirty, but they take a long time to get going, and then they do take that ongoing maintenance in a way that is not sexy. Like, you can have a ribbon cutting ceremony for the seawall. You can have a ribbon cutting ceremony for the first installation of the coral thing, but then you need to keep doing it, and politicians and funders get bored.
Yeah, so it's very funny because you just brought the case. By the way, I think we were involved in the Singapore digital twin. But it's funny that you mentioned exactly the vegetation, because I was exactly going to mention that, and I disagree, because I do think that green infrastructure and nature-based solutions is really sexy, but the beauty is subjective, right? But for instance, Mendoza, Argentina, they found out that the million trees that they have put in the city along more than 1 century, so you can see it's low, right? They found out that they can reduce the repair and maintenance in the street, in the roads, because of the shade of the streets, and so they also understand that trees can reduce temperature in the city and also control floods. And so they are doubling down in maintenance of the healthy of these trees. So they used, there was a small company there using a technology to basically create a digital twin of the 1 million trees, basically with a car, with a sensor, collecting images from all the trees there and creating a reality mesh model. And with AI, they found out if the trees were in good shape and healthy condition or not. So it was, yeah, it's very sexy, I would say.
I agree. I have to say the politicians don't.
Okay. So I'll bring us back to something that is, I don't know if it's actually finance, but we're going back to finance. I don't know how, but because finance is such an important topic, and every time I feel over the years, I've been asking this question time and time again, hoping that something evolves, and you're able to tell us that actually there are some financing mechanisms that are superstars that we should be really kind of highlighting as a best practice to finance resilience and adaptation with all the challenges that we already touched upon. So coming to you, Alex, and to you, Raffaele, because I know you're working in this space. So what do you see? What's changing? I mean, what's changing? What's new? What's promising, I guess, in terms of financing mechanisms? I guess so. No pressure to to just give us something new or something emerging.
Let me frame the debate in a way, and I know that's the role of professors, so maybe that's Raffaele should do that. But let me say, we're about to see the largest mobilization of finance going to resilience over the next few decades, given the amount of infrastructure that needs to be built around the world, and it's important, and that all that infrastructure should be resilient, right? So by framing the debate, I want to say, how do we fund new builds, new infrastructure, versus how do we retrofit existing infrastructure to make it more resilient, right? And so on the first one, I would put it to you as well that not only should you go with that saying that any new builds infra ought to be resilient, but actually the marginal cost of making that resilient is somewhat small. There's various studies suggesting it's 3 to 5% of capex. Maybe a bit provocative, but that I think is lower than the average cost overrun on a traditional infrastructure deployment. So let's collectively, and I think engineering firms have a key and central role to play in delivering that message, let's collectively ensure that all new built infrastructure around the world is resilient. And let's pay for that. It's worth it, right? So let's send that message to governments, let's send that message to developers, let's send that message to development banks. So it's a way of saying there's no real innovation there. It's just embedding the incremental cost of resilience, because we all know that the benefits will be a multiple of that. Now, The other part of the issue is what do we do with existing infrastructure? And there, arguably, it's more complicated because it's about justifying to the providers of capital that there will be quantifiable benefits that outweigh the costs. So, and you know, if you look at it from a pure finance point of view, it's a certain cost today for an uncertain level of benefit at an unknown time. So, you know, it's not the most attractive of investment propositions, to say the least. Exactly. Exactly. Now, I go back then to what we discussed, which is having frameworks for governments to say, how do I allocate, you know, my budgets? It's having frameworks at the asset level. We haven't mentioned the name yet, but there is, as Savina, Nikki, and Raphael and others know very well, a methodology now called the physical climate appraisal methodology that McDonald's, Arup, were very much instrumental in getting off the ground a few years ago. It's been promoted by the Institutional Investor Group on Climate Change. And so that should be the new normal, that you have a counterfactual where you quantify the impact of climate risks, and then you look at the resilience options, do cost-benefit analysis, and deliver changes, sometimes improvements in financial metrics, certainly as compared to the counterfactual, but also improvements in insurance metrics, and I think collectively define and quantify resilience metrics, right? Because then we can all begin to to speak the same language in terms of engineers, finances, insurers, governments. And the last thing I want to say is there is actually quite a lot of innovation in finance around this. I think the MDBs are doing a lot of work. You know, there's all kinds of acronyms and names, but there's catastrophic deferred drawdown obligation bonds where you link an improvement in resilience with contingent capital. That's from the public sector point of view. I think there's all kinds of risk pools that exist. Now, that doesn't quite reduce vulnerability, but it's important because it ensures recovery and reconstruction. And I think there are resilience bonds. There's a resilience taxonomy that was published by the Climate Bonds Initiative at the end of last year. The question is, how do we get this down to the asset level? How do we quantify the benefits and ensure it's embedded? And I think, how do we link insurance products with financing mechanisms so that there's an element of interest? And to finish, I'll say, if we can get to a point where there are price signals, then there will be an incentive. And price signals are threefold. It's insurance parameters, it's debt parameters in terms of margin reductions, higher debt capacity, and it's equity/return parameters.
Thank you. Raphael.
Yeah, align with what Alex just said. I would add two important points, I think, in the characterization of finance for infrastructure. One is the international emerging market sort of situation for which countries are facing now very high interest rates, very high level of indebtedness. Actually, they're paying more for their debt rather than investing for the future. And clearly, that's a major constraint in thinking about what are the financial mechanisms. Clearly, financial mechanism is one part of the general set of issues they're facing among priorities, which is development is the first one. And the other aspect is, which is financing and funding. So who actually is going to pay for it? So we're talking about emerging market. Clearly, there is a big role for international development institutions, for banks, multilaterals, and so forth. The other point is, which Alex also referred to, is the international financial architecture, how financial markets work. And so if we don't value long-term sort of value about resilience, then it's going to be difficult then to price it. And that has a cascading effect of the fact that investors will not get into those type of projects. That said, there are instruments that we see in emerging markets. I mean, blended finance is definitely not the solution, according to me, although there are new structures that we see. Big fund with, just thinking about this SDG blended finance, 1 billion fund with philanthropy, with the Dutch development financial institution providing the first loss guarantee, with Alliance and Insurer very active on this type of structures. These clearly are interesting models. They need to be scaled up, and that's an issue. Another important dimension when thinking about financial instruments is the social dimension, which came before. This just transition is a major factor in thinking your financing. In Singapore, there is a good example about the transition, but that should be taught also on the adaptation side, which are the transition credits, about the early incentivizing the early retirements of coal plants to be replaced by clean energy. And that's a way of thinking of the consequences. We have a big project on SOEs, which are clearly the ones that own the majority of this investment and the ones that need to think about sustainability and resilience going forward. And so the regulation, when you talk about SOEs, even if you think about UK here, the role of Ofgem, Ofwat in thinking resilient investment, is going to be key about the funding availability and the budget allocation from governments.
Thank you, Raffaele. I know you wanted to add something.
Yeah, I just wanted to add a sort of a little perspective, or bring it down, I guess, to the perspective of infrastructure asset owners and how they make decisions about investment and how they allocate the funding that they've got. We've been working a lot over the last year or so with an asset owner who are not currently planning any major new assets. They're all about maintaining, managing their existing asset base. They've got hundreds of assets. So their question is, well, how do we allocate our particular OPEX budgets to our assets, and how do we get to that question of what's the priority for us in terms of investment? And we've been working with them to change or kind of update their project investment appraisal guidance. So right down at the kind of really, some of it's really tactical level decision making about which assets we maintain or we spend money on and which don't we. And bringing climate resilience into their project investment appraisal criteria has been one of the biggest sort of things we've done. There was no way previously of recognising resilience as a benefit in their kind of benefits matrix. So bringing that as a category into the benefits matrix has made a huge amount of difference. The challenge then has been actually, do the people making investment appraisals in that organisation have the knowledge, tools, data, understanding of what the risks are, how much those might cost them if they don't do something, and how much the adaptation options will cost them. So it's the work has been as much about providing the tools, the data and the knowledge to enable staff in that organisation to make these kind of climate risk-based decisions as it is about changing the process. So yeah, you can change the process, but you also need to make sure that the people who have got to implement the process can do so.
I just wanted to bring in a point about nature on that as well, because I think one of the challenges, and I don't know if there are solutions out there yet for this, but for the nature-based solutions, because it takes long enough for them to become effective, the financing of them is quite difficult because that investment period, I guess, or construction period, planting period, is very uncertain, and you might have an event that happens and knocks the whole thing back, and then you have to do the investment again. And so from a funding model, it's sort of like, well, what do you do? And so for some of the projects that we're looking at in the Pacific where we're incorporating nature-based solutions, it's about sort of working with the community so there's sort of an ongoing engagement and more local mechanism, because otherwise you can't get that to work.
Okay, so we just reached the end of this panel. I wanted to, before I thank my panelists, just throwing one more thing at you, just a quick one. I guess it's an opportunity for you to just any final remarks or things that in your experience area of work, but actually in your own opinion, I guess, with a magic wand of, we could actually resolve, because it sounds like from the conversation we had very rich, many different themes. All of them need to evolve and we find solutions that obviously are, they require some work, require work from all of us in our own capacity. So just maybe final thoughts on how do we actually accelerate and scale up adaptation and resilience? I know we don't have to go one by one, in order. So I know you got something that you burning to say, but others maybe just final remarks on this. If you had a magic wand or first step tomorrow, okay, let's just do this tomorrow to just accelerate, scale up.
Yeah, there's no magic silver bullet there, right? But I think there are two aspects to mention once again. I think it's indeed capacity building and education. I think it's key. It's really critical that people understand the problem, understand how they can solve it, and they have the access. That there's democratization and access for the tools to use it with open data or standards that they can use to access this. This is one aspect. The other aspect that is somehow related is the stakeholder engagement, right? The engagement with the communities, it's key. And so we need to better communicate risk and resilience. And to communicate, sometimes we need to be more visual. We need to be more powerful. We need to do more storytelling and to use better tools, more visual, more attractive and appealing, like geospatial 3D tools and things like that. That I think that they can work well, and we feel and we can sense it that resonates much more in younger generation, in people than ever before, right? So I think those are the key accelerators that I would like to see happening.
I'd build on the communication one because I think it's all generations respond really well to that visualization. You have older folks who haven't grown up with the climate conversation in the same way, and so they need some more help sort of feeling what it is. But yeah, so communication, I think some of it is like what we're doing here, which is I think we need to just be sharing more. There's sharing the data, sharing standards, sharing methodologies and approaches, because some of the stuff is hard, but some of it we've figured out. So let's make sure that everybody else doesn't have to do that same learning curve, that they can actually take advantage of the bits that we have figured out. So I think it's, what Nikki was talking about before, get all the people in the room. And so it's us people, it's the communities that we're working with and whom the infrastructure is serving, and then what knowledge do they have and can bring to the table? What do we have? How do we bring that together? And then how do we share so that you can replicate faster?
Anyone else?
I would say it's adjusting the narrative and bring it forward. We all talk about 2050. We all talk about decades away. Actually, this is happening now. There is a very strong bias in the finance industry, and that's called the time value of money. Any cost 20 years out in present value terms is negligible. But that's a big problem because it means that we're not really quantifying the systemic risk. And so basically talking to governments, talking to developers, talking to financiers and saying, this year's cost of climate inaction is X. You can decline it in across sectors, across geographies, and so on. If you had that money, this is what you could do instead. And bringing that upfront to the narrative as well as forward, I think is very important.
Thank you.
Yeah, just to add to that, I think one thing maybe we could all start doing tomorrow is maybe start talking less in terms of risk and more in terms of opportunity. Or something we talk with some of our clients is there is a risk here, but there's also an opportunity for you to do really well. You deliver a service to your customers, whether it's water, whether it's energy, whether it's transportation. You want to continue doing that really well in the future. Here's what you need to do to continue doing it, rather than talk all the time about the very negative risk. I know there is a lot of risk, but sometimes it's about framing, I think.
Yeah, I was just checking through Basma's summary of recommendations from the FIDIC report, and we've covered them all on the panel. So that's Basma, good. everything's in line. But I'd just add one more, and it's actually building on something you said, Alex, in terms of the capex to make all new build infrastructure resilient is about 3 to 5%. So let's make sure that all the folks in infrastructure procurement and asset management teams have that drilled into their skulls, that budget requirement needs to be in that procurement scheme, in that scope of work as business as usual from now on. And so that will then drive all of us in with the community who respond to those RFPs when we're doing our infrastructure design work, and that will allow us to budget for that resilience work. It won't be an optional add-on that's going to, I'm sorry client, it's going to cost you a bit extra if you want to be having some resilience options here as well. No, it's going to be straight down the line. It's going to be in the scope of work already. So thanks for stimulating that thought process.
Hey.
Yeah, I agree with what was said by the panel. From the university perspective, it's the problem of, the multi-sectoral perspectives on adaptation, which needs to be brought together. And the reason why I'm an economist, but the reason why I'm Imperial is because I can work with the scientists, with the engineering department. And that's what is not happening. And that's what your role, Savina, is very important in this discussion. The narrative, the positive narrative, fundamental, because people, I think, at some point just disconnect. Too many problems, very complex. What can I do about it? What is and the problem is, then you don't take ownership of the risk. And so if we don't know who owns this risk, then nobody will do anything from a political perspective, from a governance perspective, from a finance perspective. And ultimately the young generation, because there is a lot of the discussion is happening in industry which have been there since ever. They've been doing things in the same way again and again. The resistance to change is enormous. The engineering community as others. And I think this discussion is not necessarily what everybody would think in the industry. In the finance sector and the finance department, the same. We recognize the issues, the gaps, but we're still doing the same things as we used to been doing for the last 50 years or so.
Okay, great. So thank you so much. I've made you work quite a bit this afternoon. You probably earned a drink, which I hope are there. Hopefully, yes, it's all there. Please join us. Thank you. Please join us for a drink for NIBU's reception. Have a chat. Continue.